Sitting in the cell phone parking lot of the Columbus International Airport yesterday at 10 o'clock, I was watching planes at 10 o'clock in the morning, wondering when our guest, Lily Baum Pollans, will show up on the runway. And I realized, you know what, I'm not usually outside of Knowlton at that hour because, well, either I'm teaching or doing something else. Well, I realized yesterday I don't have to teach this morning. I wonder if there's some place that our guest would like to go in Columbus that I could show her around a little bit. And so if you all know what Lily is passionate about, it's garbage. And in the Baumer context, that's not a metaphor. It's trash. So think about where would I take someone who likes garbage and trash? Where would that be? The landfill, of course, 8 miles south of Columbus on I-71, west of the freeway. If you're from Cincinnati, you know that's the welcome to Columbus. It's the mountain that welcomes you to Columbus of trash. So I just want to tell you before we got there what Lily's expression was. It was like being a kid wanting something so desperate. Oh, I want this gift so badly. And I said, hey, when I pulled up to the arrivals, I said, Lily, would you like to go to the landfill? And it was egg eyes and huge smile ear to ear. Yes, Kyle, thank you. Oh, I love going. Of course, I want to go to the landfill. So we made our way down to the south part of town, sitting in traffic. And there was a lot of traffic, lots of huge dump trucks and other vehicles full of trash, and me and my Toyota with Lily. So we're kind of inching our way up, and Lily wanted to go to the top of the mountain, the top of the trash mountain. The attendant said, no trash mountain for you because there are nails on the way up to the trash mountain, and you will puncture a tire. So we were instructed to go to the, what is it called? The resident drop-off area. Now I want you to imagine a concrete, kind of raised concrete pad that you have to go up a ramp to. And then on top of the concrete pad, people back up to this, well, you see it right here, to this concrete barrier. And underneath, on the other side of that concrete barrier, is a long linear bin, a trash bin. And strangely, you can't see it here, but right over here is the big mountain. So this is the base of the big mountain, trash mountain. And then you can see this massive, I don't understand this pond, but there's a pond at the base of the mountain. So I'm going to push the button now. Would you do that? Here's what happened.
I threw it into the water. I laid it in the tub.
Okay. So if you didn't quite get that, I gave Lily an old blue ski hat because I didn't have trash in my car to throw, but I could tell that she wanted to throw trash. So here's my old blue ski hat. Lily threw it over the bin into the water. So we were driving back to the attendants, the front gate, and laughing about there's a turtle in this blue hat that Lily has probably exterminated, or there's some sort of snail darter that eats pollution from the trash in the water. And I bring that up because I'm pulling up to the weigh station. They weigh you before and they weigh you after it, and they charge you whatever's the difference. And I was up there on the scale with a truck. So the truck was going to have to pay $1,000. So there's all this traffic in the back. So the attendant comes out and inches us back. And that was my morning at the dump. And you may be wondering, why in this academic setting am I talking about a trash trip to this landfill? I didn't plan on doing that. I planned on, reading something printed, but it occurred to me yesterday that we are so fortunate to have this from people all over the world coming here with a passion, and they're passionate about something. And I realized how passionate Lily is about trash, and it made me think, I'm not going to do the normal introductions. We ought to tell the story of the trash. But here's some of the formal part. Lily is the undergraduate chair at Hunter College, city planning. Also has written books about garbage. What was the title? Resisting Garbage. That was the latest book. Now focusing on plastic. So I hope that you can see the love of garbage and the passion that Lily's bringing to us from New York. So with that, come on up. Welcome to Lily.
Okay, I can't believe that my introduction is so thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you all for inviting me, and thank you for the dump tour, which is really, truly really special. And I love a good dump, and a lot of times you can't just go to them. So it is actually really special to live in a place where you could just visit the dump, and any of you could go there. They were really nice and welcoming, and they even do tours. So we didn't get to do that, but pitch in case you want to. So I was going to start by noting that garbage can really be anything. It really can be anything. It can be reality TV or the dumpster fire of social media, or depending on your point of view, politics. But really, for me, hang on. I might need some. Oh no, figured it out. Okay. I think of garbage as the most honest biography of our civilization. So at every scale, from the individual to sort of the mass collective, we discard everything that does not have value to us. We also discard what is inconvenient. We discard what is irritating. We discard what is shameful. So when we look carefully at our discards and at the various infrastructures that we have built to keep them hidden, then we can see clearly who we care for, and what we care for, and what we consider to be extraneous. So processes of discard, they are sometimes metaphorical. And in the field of discard studies, which is outside of planning, the area that I kind of consider home, in the field of discard studies, discards can be almost anything. They can be populations that are discarded by climate change. It can be the top of the mountain that is discarded to mine coal. It could be the town of East Palestine that is discarded when a vinyl chloride train blows up in the middle of it. It can be our very organs that become the disposal sites for microplastics. So I find this field of discard studies to be really helpful for making sense of the various ways that our economic system lays waste at every scale. And this is just a few examples of literature from discard studies, which some of it overlaps with planning, some of it is really different, but all of it is really interesting. But at the end of the day, I'm an urbanist, and therefore I'm really concerned with actual garbage, the stuff that we throw out every day, the stuff that ends up at the Swaco dump just south of here. And we encounter 1,000 things every single day, and I want to understand where all those things came from and where they're all going. And I want to understand the impacts that they have on the people and places that they interact with. I want to understand flows of matter across scales, across geographies, across states of being. And I really want to understand the way that cities, as political organizations that are charged with waste management, how they govern those flows of materials. What is the role of cities in managing materials within a global scale consumption economy that requires waste to grow? So I'm going to talk today about garbage, or municipal waste is the kind of technical term, and we call it that because it's the stuff that cities manage. So municipal waste is where I want to start. And I'm going to begin by pointing out that municipal waste is maybe just 2% of the total amount of solid waste that is generated throughout the entire economy. So starting with extraction, and then the extraction of raw materials from the earth, and the manufacturing, the kind of refinement of those materials into products that can be traded and sold, through the processes of kind of packaging and preparation for retail and consumption. All of that creates hundreds of times the amount of waste that gets generated at the very end that we ever come into contact with. So if this section of municipal waste is really only 2% of the total amount of waste that is generated by the economy, then should we waste time thinking about it? Is it relevant? A lot of people in discard studies think no, but I think that it is really, really important. And there are many reasons why, but the main thing that I want us all to understand here is that all of this is only possible if there is efficient waste management at the urban scale. No matter how good we make disposal, how good we make landfilling or incineration or even recycling, all of this process of waste management at the local level just serves to make everything else possible. Efficient local waste management really props up this entire system, this entire global materials economy. So in this sense, municipal solid waste matters a lot at far larger scales than the city itself. And so if that's correct, which I think it is, then what I want to know is if cities manage the waste differently, if they made different choices about how to manage those material flows, could that force change in the rest of the system? Could that tail wag the dog? And what would that look like? What would it actually mean to manage waste differently at the municipal level? And I'm going to come back to that question in just a second. But first I want to provide kind of a sense of scale beyond this sort of abstract, 2%, 98%. So the United States generates about 300 million tons of municipal solid waste every year. This data is old. It's from 2018, which was the last time that the EPA published any estimates about waste generation. So it's the best that we have, although it's probably an underestimate given how much time has passed. So about 50% of that 300 million tons is recyclable through conventional recycling systems. So that's paper, glass, metal, plastic. And another third of that material is organic and could be composted using a variety of extant technologies like composting or anaerobic digestion that could potentially generate products or nutrients, sort of reduce the organic materials to nutrients that could be applied in some beneficial way. So that 300 tons is managed by local governments. And local governments decide what is disposable and what they're going to do with all of those materials. And I don't think that most cities think very carefully about what constitutes the waste stream in their location. They don't think so much about the individual components or constituents of that waste stream. In both policy and practice, local governments just tend to think of this as a pile of unwanted stuff, non-hazardous, although it actually can be hazardous, but it's classified as non-hazardous, but disagreeable material that they want to remove efficiently. These are just, I pulled the definition from Columbus, but also from New York. What is it? It's just icky things that we don't want. And the product of that kind of lack of consideration or definition is this, what cities actually do with their waste. So that little yellow part, that's organic material. They call it composting in this graph, but it's not actually probably composting. It's probably something else, but that's organic material that is separated from the waste stream and treated separately. The dark blue is what is separated from the waste stream to be recycled, although this graph doesn't tell us how much actually returns to the market versus how much gets sort of disposed later on. This is just how much is separated at source. And the gray bit, that's landfilling. So more than half of the waste that is generated and then managed by cities is landfilled. And that is suboptimal for many reasons. One reason is that 15% of our methane emissions in the United States come from landfills. So all that organic material that's not getting separated is going into landfills where it decomposes anaerobically and emits methane into the atmosphere. Sometimes it's captured and flared, sometimes it just goes out there. And every other disposal technology, including recycling, has all kinds of externalities that we really don't account for in any way, certainly not in the cost of the materials that we're sending to them. But incineration produces a whole variety of carcinogens and endocrine disruptors. Even recycling generates a huge amount of emissions from shipping, from transportation, from melting down plastic, which is a really dirty process. So none of these, the impacts of these disposal, it's all bad. And most of the time, Columbus is an exception. That's your dump, isn't that pretty? Columbus is an exception, but most of the time the impacts of these disposal facilities fall outside of the jurisdiction where the waste was generated, which means that the communities that have to bear the impacts of all of that pollution have no political power over the source of those materials. And that's basically, how the whole entire, how our waste system is organized in this country. So I want to come back to this main question about what it might mean to manage waste differently. And if there's anything that cities can do locally that might impact in a meaningful way the sort of impacts of disposal or the whole chain that comes before. So cities and towns don't have infinite flexibility. They don't have infinite options when it comes to waste management. And the options that they do have are highly constrained, maybe by politics, maybe by economics, maybe by available infrastructure. And we often think of these constraints as local, like Columbus has a landfill, so therefore it uses a landfill instead of, shipping waste further to an incinerator. But actually, I think that it's more useful to think of these constraints as bigger than local. Across the US, with only minor variation, cities and towns actually just share the same very small, very suboptimal set of options for what to do with their waste. So discard scholars think of this set of constraints as a waste regime. And waste regimes encompass a variety of policies, of processes, of cultural norms, organizations, people that all work together to decide what should be disposable, and then to establish the options for dealing with those disposable things. Waste regimes kind of establish a hegemonic idea of what waste is and what are appropriate treatment strategies. So, in other words, we can kind of think of the waste regime as this whole chain and all of the ideas associated with it. I call our waste regime here in the US a weak recycling waste regime, which rests on traditional goals of municipal hygiene and kind of teaches municipal waste managers that their main job is just to remove waste quickly and efficiently as a matter of public health. But then it's structured and reinforced by a specific set of actors, which include manufacturers of packaging and disposable things and the companies that produce the materials to create those packages and disposable things. It includes corporate waste managers, and it includes all of the lobbyists and PR people and marketing professionals that support those industries. And then it also includes the public officials who don't question the solutions that are provided by those industrial actors. So these actors work together to advocate for policies that are beneficial for their business, which basically means they advocate for disposability. And then those policies determine what kinds of materials are in the waste stream and what the options are for dealing with them. So just to be really clear, the weak recycling waste regime operates around a few key rules, which it is always reinforcing through messaging and marketing and PR. In the weak recycling waste regime, garbage isn't really a problem. In fact, it's just a natural output of economic growth. And it only becomes a problem if it is treated improperly, usually by an individual who maybe litters or dumps something where it's not supposed to go or doesn't recycle properly. So therefore, it's every individual's responsibility to manage waste properly by putting it in the right bin. And a great deal of work goes into reinforcing this message of individual responsibility. There are cues reminding us of our individual role in creating waste and our responsibility for managing it everywhere we go. And if you start to look around, you'll see it everywhere. It's on every Amazon package that comes with the recycling logo. It's on every public trash can. It's all over the place. So in the weak recycling waste regime, recycling was devised by a particular set of industrial actors, mainly from the packaging industries, as a strategy for offloading the costs of disposability onto individuals in the public sector. So recycling was kind of crafted and then sold to the public as a way to avoid regulatory action on disposable products. And cities and towns now pay to recycle the material that those industries profit from. Oh yeah, I just highlighted this because this is the really important part. And I want to note that this kind of process has unfolded over a really long time, and this is like not abstract. This is like quite concrete, and they're actual, like when I'm talking about the kind of marketing organizations and the PR firms and the lobbying organizations, like they are actual identifiable organizations, often kind of in the guise of environmental nonprofits or think tanks that are funded. These are the funders for the Recycling Partnership. They're funded by the most profitable companies in the world of disposability. So these are actual, like you can trace the money, you can see the flows, and these are the organizations that benefit from cities bearing the cost of recycling and waste management, and who profit from us taking individual responsibility for waste management. So let's come back to my central questions. Is it possible for cities to make meaningful change in their waste management if they all kind of exist within this same regime? If we look at, like, here's just a selection of mid-sized cities. If we look at the rankings, there's like cities that divert a huge amount of waste, and there's cities that divert very little. Is there a difference, a meaningful difference between the cities at the top and the cities at the bottom? And by the way, Columbus, right there at the top, 54% diversion rate. I checked this morning, way to go. So anyway, do those differences even matter? So I think they do, but it's not in the number. It's not in the diversion rate. It's not in the kind of like typical statistics that a policymaker might lean on. Rather, it is in the way that the city orients itself towards the waste regime. So some cities will kind of just think about their waste management as an efficiency exercise. The goal is just to collect and dispose of the material as quickly and as cheaply as possible. And that is a compliant waste regime. That's a city that's not questioning what garbage is and not questioning its responsibilities in any kind of fundamental way. But there are cities that orient themselves differently, that might start to think about waste management as an exercise in material stewardship or environmental justice. And those places, they do craft different policy, but they also start with a fundamentally different premise about their job, about the role of the city in the waste regime. And I think that that's what's significant. And I want to give you a couple of examples from my book that kind of show what the compliant versus the defiant looks like in practice. So this story begins in the 1980s, in a moment when cities all across the country were losing disposal capacity for a whole variety of reasons that I won't explain because it would take a long time. But basically, the two case studies in my book, Seattle and Boston, both found themselves without any landfill capacity. And they had to, that caused like a huge spike in costs, and they had to make really quick decisions. And what I discovered is that like the way that the two cities responded to this crisis kind of set them onto different wasteways. It sent them into different paths or different orientations to the waste regime. And I will just describe what that looked like. So in Boston, this was a compliant waste regime, a city that turned righteously to a compliant wasteway, which basically means it behaved very predictably in the limits of the weak recycling waste regime. So I want to emphasize that Boston and Seattle were really quite different, really quite similar in terms of waste management in this moment. I mean, we think of them as being like wildly maybe different in terms of culture or politics, but really in this moment it was not so wildly different. Neither city had recycling. They both had like somewhat kind of progressive city governments, similar economies. Like they really had a lot in common. Although the private recycling market may have been a little more developed in Seattle, but in Boston, citizens really wanted to recycle so much that they developed a kind of like grassroots organized recycling program that like different community groups ran themselves, and this is a bumper sticker from one of them. So they were down with like recycling and alternative methods of waste management. So by the 1980s, Boston had no local disposal capacity, like I mentioned. There was an incinerator that was located right in the center of the city that was closed down in 1975 because of repeated air quality violations. And all over the state, for reasons I don't have time to explain, landfill capacity was shrinking. And so the city had no disposal capacity. They had to export all of their waste, and it was starting to get really, really expensive. So they started, in this disposal crunch, they decided they needed to figure out a better solution. And the first thing that they turned to was incineration. The city's chief engineer was this guy, Joe Casaza. He was a member of Keep America Beautiful, which you might remember from the environmental nonprofit slide a few slides ago. So Joe really prioritized hygiene and cleanliness and anti-litter, and he just wanted a reliable technology that would allow him to dispose of Boston's waste cheaply and consistently without any surprises. And so he felt that incinerator was the best solution. He convinced the mayor at the time, Kevin White, that this was the best idea. They got some contractors who agreed to build it. They did an environmental impact review. This beautiful rendering is from that report. And then, it just so happened that there was a mayoral election, and then there was a new mayor, and the new guy, Ray Flynn, he didn't want to do it because it came from his predecessor, just like old Boston politics. And so he was like, let's hold on a second. Why don't we do some planning? And he established a committee with a few people on it, and then he gave them this very narrow remit. He was like, okay, I've got a process, and he asked his committee, which was just some neighborhood representatives and some city business representatives, to basically see if the incinerator was a good idea or if they should export waste. And he asked them to comment on 2 export plans and the incinerator plan. And by the way, I didn't mention, but the incinerator was going to go in the same site as the old one. So it was kind of it was kind of easy. And I just highlighted here some of the text, the people on the committee felt like this was too narrow, and that they should have been able to consider other options, that they should have been able to look at, at recycling or waste diversion, that they should have been able to consider a smaller incinerator. They had a lot of questions that they weren't allowed to evaluate. But that was the full extent of the public process, was just this report. Or this little committee and then the report that they did. And I just want to point, this was sort of really indicative, this really narrow framing of what the options were going to be. It was indicative of the entire way that the city government approached planning. And really, garbage was kind of secondary to all of this. Politics drove the decision not to build the incinerator right away, and then once they had this kind of semi-public process, they had a kind of variety of other political exigencies that really drove the decision making. And here's just one more example. So the Flynn administration, they never looked at other sites for the incinerator. They were only going to use this site in the area called South Bay. But at the same time, they had all these other things that were happening in the city, a judge ruled that so that was South Bay in that little red circle. A judge ruled that they had to clean up Boston Harbor. So they were because it was disgusting. So then they were okay, we need to build a big regional sewage treatment plant. That's great, let's do it. And then they were where can we put that? Well, we'll put it over here on this little island. That'll be really convenient, except for oh crap, there's already something on that island. It's an old prison that never should have been built there. It was a quarantine facility and was built, without heat, and now houses people for years at a time, and that's bad. And that's going to conflict with the sewage treatment plant. But guess what? The same characteristics that make a site excellent for an incinerator, according to the logics of the time, also made the site perfect for a prison. So then the Flynn administration was well, why don't we just put them both there? We can put the jail on one side and we can put the incinerator on the other. And they really seriously considered that for a minute. And then the state, through reasons that have nothing to do with anything ethical, but only because the state Senate president, who by the way was Billy Bulger, and if you follow mafia history, that will be a familiar name. Billy Bulger and Ray Flynn grew up together in Southie, and they hated each other, and Bulger was you want to do this? I say no. And so then the city had to build the prison on the site, and they couldn't build the incinerator, and no one ever thought about garbage, ever. And so that's how Boston made the decisions. And basically what that meant was that in the absence of kind of any robust public process, in the absence of any consideration of the material itself, they sort of defaulted to the solutions that were provided to them by the waste regime. And this is a quote from like a really wonderful person who I actually was able to interview when I was doing this research, who was the policy director, who was like, we only had a couple of options. It was like in town, out of town, burn it or bury it. And they just lacked the imagination or the will to really see beyond the options provided by the waste regime. And it's not to say, like, people in Boston were thinking about alternatives at the time, and I want to make that really clear. But those ideas were not filtering into the decision makers, who were driven really by this kind of the external logics of the waste regime. And in the end, they decided to export all of their waste to a nearby incinerator, and this is still where all of the city's garbage goes. It's in a town called Saugus, and you might wonder if that's a landfill. Yes, it is. And that area, the green right behind it, is where they bury all the ash from the incinerator. Good job, Boston. So Seattle had a really different kind of story. Seattle was what I consider to be a defiant wasteway. And basically, Seattle, same as Boston, lost all their disposal capacity by the early 1980s. Same as Boston, in an area with disposal constraints, and so they had to think really, they had to basically start exporting their garbage, and it caused an immediate spike in costs, which kind of created a lot of political anxiety around this issue. And unlike, just one note, the one kind of major difference between Seattle and Boston is that Seattle's waste management operates as a utility. So when the costs escalated, people noticed it right away because it translated into their bills. So there was a kind of public awareness about this, which just caused a kind of lack of confidence in the city in terms of waste management decision making, which I think is relevant. So basically, in terms from the city's point of view, they were like, we lost our disposal capacity, now disposal costs money, like this is a disposal problem. And every single document that I was able to find from this period of time in Seattle refers to the city's garbage disposal problem. So what's the solution to a garbage disposal problem? Just more disposal capacity. So just like in Boston, they were like, let's just build an incinerator, because then we could maybe get some, we could generate some energy, like then it might make, we might even make money. Like this is a really great idea. Unlike in Boston, they actually had kind of more of a public decision-making process around this decision to build an incinerator. And immediately, as soon as it was announced that this was a consideration, the city was flooded with public input, both through planning processes and just like people just write letters to city councilors, and they write letters to the head of the garbage utility, and they write letters to, the mayor, like everybody writes letters to everybody. And what's weird about Seattle is that somebody reads them and they write back. Like as a person from the East Coast, this is just like unfathomable, but that's what happens in Seattle. And the way that they framed the issues was really interesting. So there's like some, in some documents, there's like a thread of NIMBY, like this seems like a great idea, but like let's put it in the county and not in the city. Or like, just not here, please. But a lot of the other, a lot of the content of the protest letters really had to do with like, this is irresponsible. There's valuable stuff in this trash and we should be taking care of it. Or like, if you burn it, it's just gonna create pollution that someone's gonna breathe in, or it's gonna be a burden on my children. Like they were really placing the material, like the physical garbage, into a temporal context, into a spatial context, and understanding it in a broader lifespan, material lifespan. And that is really different. That is not waste regime thinking. That is a kind of violation of waste regime thinking in a really interesting way. And so, it's not necessarily surprising that people in Seattle were thinking this in the early 1980s. Like it's kind of on the heels of a huge environmental movement. People were really conscious about garbage. But what's amazing is how Seattle reacted. So the city went from, these are newsletters that the utility published and sent to customers. So they went from basically determining that waste to energy or incineration was going to be their solution to a kind of approach where they thought maybe we could do like some of each. Like we'll have a little incinerator and then we'll have some recycling. And then like within a few years, incineration was off the table altogether. So it had this dramatic impact. This public input just completely reframed the city's thinking about what solutions were possible. At the same time, the city was locked into kind of a political conflict with the county. So the county was receiving the waste from Seattle, and they were charging this like massive surcharge on every ton. And there was like a lot of wrangling between like, if we're going to build incinerators, should we like coordinate with the county and we'll do it all together? Or should we like everybody do it separately? And both, like the county wanted to partner with the city because they wanted to keep the revenues. And the city started to think like we really should probably do this by ourselves because the worst possible outcome is that we share infrastructure and then we have to take care of like someone else's garbage. And that was like unthinkable. So in the end, this sort of, both cities kind of wanted to maintain, both the county and the city wanted to maintain control of the garbage flows. And that became this sort of, the waste itself became a source of political power. And that kind of reframed again the way that the city officials were thinking about what decisions were possible. So like through these reframings, the city basically decided they were going to take care of their own infrastructure, they were going to do it themselves, and they were going to prioritize waste diversion over disposal. So they did end up contracting with a landfill in Eastern Oregon. They're still using that landfill. But in the process, this project the process of all of this public input and all of the planning and discourse around trash meant that the city was now thinking about trash as something other than just a mass of unwanted materials. It was a material resource, it was a source of political power, and if managed properly, it could be kind of a thing that benefited the city into the future. And this kind of reframing, I won't go through all of this. This kind of reframing basically created an institutional foundation for a completely reoriented waste system. So they developed methods of accountability, they developed reporting mechanisms, they developed a kind of aptitude for experimentation, so that they are really willing to try things, to pilot things, to test, to fail, and to maintain a commitment to the fundamental reorientation that occurred in the 1980s. And so I think these are really these are the characteristics of a defiant waste regime. It's this reorientation, the kind of shift in the institutional environment. And then those shifts allow the city to do things like have a really effective recycling program and a really effective organics diversion program, and then eventually actual waste reduction programs, like the elimination of styrofoam, the elimination of telephone books back when that was a thing. And so the city has really been aggressive in figuring out how to turn responsibility back on producers and how to just eliminate materials from the waste stream that are the most difficult to manage. It's not easy, and like the waste regime has a way of they're able to kind of discipline cities that go too far, and this happens consistently in Seattle, and here's just one example. In 2009, just after Seattle approved one of the first plastic bag fees, they were sued by a coalition of plastic bag lobbyists, and that this organization also triggered a referendum, a citywide referendum on the bag fees, and they outspent the bags fee supporters 9-1. They still lost, but it really kind of demonstrates the value of city waste management, right? Like the amount that these organizations are willing to pay for these kind of like really like small change city programs demonstrates how significant it is and how the kind of, I think, there's politics at stake more than just the actual profitability of plastic bags in Seattle. And they launch these campaigns every time a city proposes laws like this. And there was, the kind of, we can see an evolving strategy from waste regime actors in the way that they've shifted attention in many instances from local lobbying to state level lobbying. So this map was put together by Jenny Romer, who's an environmental lawyer who's done a lot of work on plastic, municipal plastic bans, and it just shows all the states in orange. It shows the states that have state-level preemption laws that prevent municipalities from regulating plastic bags or other kinds of single-use plastics. So there's a lot of them, and the kind of lobbyists have become, they're constantly learning, they're constantly innovating, they're really savvy, and they're willing to spend ungodly amounts of money to reorient policy towards their own ends. So just to come back to Seattle, Seattle is still a creature of the waste regime, and it still has to respond to the kind of these efforts at discipline. But nevertheless, since 2000, I don't know how well you can see this, but basically between 2000 and 2023, the per capita waste generation in the city of Seattle went from 2.72 pounds per person per day to 2.04 pounds per person per day. So the overall population in Seattle is growing, but the total amount of trash that they are generating is hardly budging, which means that they've been really successful in figuring out, and that's generation. That has nothing to do with recycling. It has nothing to do with what's getting diverted for composting. And like people ask all the time, like it's because Seattle is like, a lot of single family houses, and there's all these sort of excuses, and I think like, yeah, it's true, they have some kind of natural advantages, but like this is the result of a willingness to consistently engage with people, to teach people, to educate, to enforce, and to experiment, and to do the hard work of actually figuring out how to do waste reduction at a local scale. So, what we really see looking at Boston and Seattle side by side is that cities actually can orient themselves differently to the waste regime. And cities that, they can prioritize producer responsibility, they can prioritize that over, they can prioritize both hygiene and material stewardship. They can do things that can reorient their institutions away from disposability. So thinking about that has really, I just continue to think about this relationship. There we go. I continue to think about these relationships, and it's kind of continuing to sit with me. Clearly there is this coalition of industries and lobbyists that are trying to shape municipal solid waste management policy to ensure continued profitability. But this did not start in the 1980s. This didn't start with Seattle and Boston's waste crisis. There's definitely a longer history here. We know this because Keep America Beautiful was founded in the 1950s. So then I started to think about how else have cities cooperated with regime interests historically. So that question has become the seed of my next project. And if I have still a few more minutes, I just want to share some of my early thinking from that work. I haven't published this yet. I'm really excited about feedback. So if you have questions or ideas, I'm going on sabbatical next year, I'm going to write this book, and I would be thrilled to have your input. So basically, kind of with this question, what else? Where else has the city played a role in kind of shaping the waste regime one way or another? And I've started to kind of, after stewing on it for a long time, I decided to focus specifically on plastic. And I've chosen plastic for a bunch of reasons. One is that it's a sub-industry of fossil fuels, and therefore it has access to all of the public relations, all of the marketing, all of the lobbying and know-how and money of the fossil fuel industry. It's also a ubiquitous material. Probably everything in this room is some amount of plastic, even this wall material, which probably is constituted with some sort of plastic adhesive, the coatings, everything you're wearing, it is so ubiquitous, it is everywhere. And third, it has been, since the 1960s, the fastest growing segment of the municipal waste stream. So I see it as just a really relevant material that requires a little bit more interrogation. And after kind of really thinking about it for a while, this is my question. What role have cities played in the global diffusion of plastics? And as, well, I'm gonna skip that. Once I started looking, I realized that cities have actually played a much bigger role here than I imagined when I first started doing the research. and it's not just through waste management. That is just a part of the story. So I'm going to share with you just one anecdote, which is from New York City. That's why this picture. This is New York City in the 1960s. So the story actually begins in this building, which is a sort of nondescript office building. It was at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, which was like a little tech university that got folded into NYU eventually. But in this room in 1962, a group of men gathered and one woman. The woman was Betsy. She was the secretary. And everyone else in the room represented an organization that stood to profit from an accelerated building and development process in New York City. So they were representatives from building trades, from developers, from housing, from manufacturers of different building products and materials, and a few municipal staff, and like a handful of scientists for good measure. And they had gotten together under the auspices of the Real Estate Board of New York to rewrite the city's building code. So the city's code at this point had been kind of more or less untouched since the 1890s, so it was high time for modernization. And this group thought that modernization of the building code would allow them to build things much more quickly and cheaply. So the plastics industry had been working at this point, the early 1960s, already for a decade or more to demonstrate that plastics could revolutionize architecture and construction. So they had, they were doing demonstrations, they were doing trainings. The plastics industry wanted the world to know that you could make buildings out of plastic. They had figured out how to do molding. They'd figured out how to make it colorful. They'd figured out how to make it have structural integrity. The only problem was flammability. So it took the industry a long time to figure out how to make plastic, which is made of fossil fuel, how to make it not burn. And so eventually they did that by adding PFAS, forever chemicals, which maybe you've heard of. So that's how they made it, that's how they reduced the flammability of plastics. And once they figured this out, the next challenge was to train to kind of revise building codes and then train building code officials on the promise of these materials. And so New York City was not alone here. Cities all across the country were, since the 1950s. Actually, I learned this morning at the Ohio State Building Standards, the Office of Building Standards, that Ohio has permitted plastic in buildings since at least 1957. So I don't know if you should be proud of that or not, but it's a fact. And I learned it from the building code guy who looks exactly like Jeff Bridges and is really nice if you ever want to go hang out with him. So New York, so it wasn't the first to make these changes. They did eventually in 1968 vote in a brand new building code. It was a performance-based code. It replaced the kind of ancient previous building code, and it allowed. I haven't included this slide. It allowed what they called every modern material and building process. And this was a point of pride, and everyone agreed that this was like a wild success. And so New York, as I said, it wasn't the first to do this, but it is such a huge market that it had a really big impact on the building industry. And in the early 1970s, thanks in part to New York City, but also the many other cities that were undergoing similar processes, the plastics industry boomed, even when the rest of the economy was basically tanking. So all the other sectors were sort of shrinking, plastics was growing, and they chalked that up to construction, building construction, largely. So I mentioned several times today these lobbying organizations. In New York, at the beginning, there were no plastics lobbyists in the building code committee that was rewriting the code at first. But what I noticed as I began to do my research is that I saw increasing reference to the Society of Plastics Industry, which is the main, it was at the time the main industry lobbying group. And in the beginning, they were just on the mailing list. They were among hundreds of others. And slowly over the course of the planning process, they had kind of gotten themselves into an advisory role like a non-voting advisory role on the Central Code Committee. So they were doing this all over the country, kind of sneakily getting themselves in under the guise of being experts on the new materials, like on these novel materials and their uses, on the safety standards. And so they were right there at the table making this new code. Now, at the very same time, well, almost at the exact same time that the building code was being revised, New York City was undergoing a completely distinct legislative process about something completely different. So the city was in a budget crisis. You all may know what it was like to try and run cities in the late 1960s, early 70s. They were nearly bankrupt. And one clever civil servant had the idea that if they taxed packages, like packaging waste, that would help them reduce their waste management costs, which were skyrocketing because of all the disposable stuff and the increase in the waste stream. It would help them reduce those costs and maybe shrink the waste stream over time. So they developed this whole plan where they would tax packages based on how difficult it was to dispose of the material. So plastic packages got like a special extra tax. And it was a really great idea. And everyone loved it. And all of the economists were like, this is really smart, like the city's gonna make a lot of money, it's gonna be really, valuable. And then, so they passed it. Like it was almost uncontroversial. And the city council passed it. But it will surprise nobody that the law was never enacted, because the moment that it was about to be implemented, the Society of Plastics Industry sued the city. And they won. And I'm not going to tell you how they did that right now, but maybe I can later. So basically, this organization, which had successfully gotten plastics embedded into the city building code, like with the other hand, was also minimizing the ability of the city to regulate consumer plastics in the waste stream. And I do just want to note that according to one plastics manufacturer, and this data is, it's from 2015, but I haven't yet been able to find more recent data. But packaging and construction eat up the vast majority of plastic that's manufactured. So those remain kind of the largest. Those categories absorb the largest amount of plastic material. So this work that the Society of Plastics Industry was doing in the 1960s in New York City has kind of led to a world in which plastic is just sort of freely flowing into these particular sectors. And the last piece of this story is that, while all of this was happening, I don't think the general public really had any idea how much the plastics industry was orchestrating local policy behind the scenes, but they were very worried about garbage, as you saw in Seattle case. And SPI, the Society of Plastics Industry, was tracking public opinion on waste and sponsoring study after study to position plastics as a solution to all of the problems caused by garbage in general. And they were campaigning for waste to energy incineration really actively. So they gave NYU $80,000 to do a study to show that plastics incinerated beautifully and had a lot of embodied energy. So they were out there creating the narrative that incineration was going to be the solution to garbage, and then selling that idea back to cities. So when we saw Boston and Seattle both magically came up with this idea for an incinerator, that was because lobbyists were going door to door in cities like Seattle and Boston and proposing the incinerator solution. So the dynamics of the weak recycling waste regime and the role of the plastics industry in it are shifting somewhat right now under the new presidential administration. So the previous presidential administration, I will note, was really adverse to regulating plastics explicitly, and they invested a ton of money, the Biden administration, in research around all of these novel recycling techniques for plastic, which were neither novel or even really recycling, but they spent a lot of money researching them. But under the Biden administration, some constraints on fossil fuel development still meant that the kind of public face of the marketing arms of fossil fuels were oriented towards renewable energy. But now, with a kind of very massive deregulation of the fossil fuel industry, these fossil fuel companies have kind of abandoned publicly all of their commitments to renewables, and they've quietly rekindled a whole bunch of plans to build massive new plastics manufacturing facilities. These are just 3 that have been announced since January. So all of my research kind of points to the fact that local governments are constrained in key ways in terms of the role that they're playing in the waste regime, but they do have more power than they typically recognize. So cities obviously have to collect and dispose of garbage. This is a basic public health responsibility, but they don't have to cooperate with all of the systems of disposability. They can seek to push responsibility for disposable stuff back on to manufacturers. They can ban materials that are difficult and expensive to dispose of. They can advocate for state-level policy that takes local action and expands upon it or makes it more possible. They can regulate what buildings are made of, and they can regulate what happens to buildings when they are dismantled and replaced. So these are all decisions that are made, locally, from building codes through the choice of disposal technology that really directly impact landscapes of production and consumption. And the first step to making use of this power is to recognize it, to sort of understand the city as a site for altering dynamics of consumption and production, and for refocusing municipal policy from bare bones efficiency towards more ambitious ends. So I will wrap up there. And take questions.